But I wanted to think particularly about Odin. And this ties into something we were looking at this morning, this Yggdrasil. Odin is, in many ways, the most important of the Norse gods. He is the father of the gods, so one of his names, his kennings, is All-Father. He's the god associated with battle, and with the dead, and with wisdom, and with poetry. Odin has many names and many guises. What he's best known for in some of the sagas is that he wanders the world in disguise, under different pseudonyms, intervening in the lives of human beings, particularly warriors, so particularly a male elite, that's who he's particularly interested in, determining the outcomes of battles, giving gifts to his favourite warriors. Here are some images of Odin. So on the right hand side there, that's a nice 19th century painting called Odin the Wanderer, which I think nicely gets across that image, that idea of him as a kind of shadowy, mysterious wanderer type figure. I mean, to us, people who've seen the Tolkien films, obviously he looks like Gandalf, and that's a big influence on Tolkien's idea of Gandalf as the Wanderer. And a lot of his names, his pseudonyms, associate him with being like being called the Stranger, or the Wanderer, or the Walker, or the Guest, the mysterious guest. What we've got at the top here is an image from an 18th century Icelandic manuscript. You can see in both these images he's only got one eye, because he famously sacrificed one of his eyes in order to gain wisdom. You can see that he's got these two ravens, that's what they are meant to be, although they just look like slightly odd sparrows or something, but his two ravens are called Hugin and Munin, which mean thought and memory. The myths say that they fly around the world and bring him information from everywhere. And that's one reason that he's so wise, is that he has these information-gathering ravens who come and tell him things. Another of his names, or his kennings, is Raven God, so he's very strongly associated with ravens. And you can see them too in this image, which is a 10th century little silver object, which probably shows Odin sitting on his throne, which is called Hlithskjalf, high seat. And from Hlithskjalf, you can see into all the 9 worlds. So when he sits there, he can see into all the worlds. And there again are the ravens perched on the side of the statue. It's quite like what a Viking or an Anglo-Saxon throne would be, with these kind of horse head carvings there. So Odin is associated with all these kind of ways of getting information, getting wisdom, whether that's going out into the world and travelling, or being on his high seat, being able to look out into the world and then hearing from the ravens. And clearly the fact that Hugin and Munin mean thought and memory, that suggests something about his own mind, doesn't it, and the powers of his mind, which he might send out into the world, or cast back in memory, or something like that. So the powers of your cognitive processes, the mental processes of thinking and wisdom, and Odin's associated with all those things. And a lot of the stories about Odin deal with other ways in which he acquired wisdom or knowledge, or specific kinds of wisdom. So the first one we're going to look at is the story which explains the name of Yggdrasil, actually, so it explains the name of the tree. Ygg is one of Odin's names. It means the terrible one. And so Yggdrasil means Odin's steed, or Odin's horse, the thing that Odin rode. And the reason it has that kenning as a name is that Odin rode it, i.e. hanged himself upon it, in order to gain wisdom. And we know about this from one of the poems of the Poetic Edda, called Halvamal. Halvi means the High One. So Halvamal means the sayings of the High One. In this case it's Odin, so it's Odin speaking in this poem. And some of what he says is describing his sacrifice to himself on Yggdrasil, so a key moment in Norse mythology. But then quite a lot of the rest of the poem is a collection of rather mundane, ordinary, earthly proverbs and maxim statements about how to be a good guest, or how not to overindulge yourself at meals, or being cautious when you're travelling, and the values of very practical kinds of wisdom. Don't praise the day until it's over, because you have to see what it's like before you decide that it was a good day, or always be careful in someone else's house. Sit near the door in someone else's house in case you have to make a quick escape, that kind of thing. But then you also get these much more mysterious statements. So if you look at the handout, and Odin says, I know that I hung on the windy tree 9 long nights, wounded with a spear, dedicated to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree of which no man knows from where its roots run. No bread did they give me, nor a drink from a horn. Downwards I looked. I took up the runes. Screaming I took them, then I fell back again. 9 mighty spells I learnt from the famous son of Bolthor, Vestla's father, and I got a drink of the precious mead poured from Odin. Then I began to quicken and be wise, and to grow and to prosper. One word found another word for me. One deed found another deed for me. The allusions here that you need to understand, Bolthor and Bestlir are the giants, Odin's own ancestors. So Odin is, as I said this morning, one of the sons of Bur, and Bolthor and Bur are father and son. So the suggestion is that he has in some way accessed the wisdom of the giants by this sacrifice. So what this seems to be is some kind of voluntary sacrifice, a decision to die, on Yggdrasil, on the windy tree, the tree of which no man knows from where its roots run. A kind of double death, actually. So not just that he hanged on the tree, but also wounded with a spear. So a kind of magical, or like it has a double power, because there's 2 methods of death. And I guess the suggestion is that he's somehow gained access to the wisdom of the dead, the wisdom of the underworld. And the 2 poems, Völuspá and Vafthrudnismál, show Odin going to talk to someone from the world of the dead, so the prophetess, or the giant. So like this is another form of accessing the wisdom of the giants, or accessing the wisdom of the dead. And in this case it costs him his own life, so a sacrifice that he has apparently chosen to make, myself to myself. So there's no sense that there's somebody else forcing him to do this, it's his own choice. So there's kind of an obvious crucifixion parallel here. This is something that Snorri would have been aware of too. It's interesting that it's sort of very much framed as being a conquest over, or rather a desire to attain wisdom or knowledge. And the wisdom that he gains is associated with runes. Okay, so he says, I took up the runes, screaming I took them, and I fell back again. So when you imagine that downwards I looked, he's hanging on the tree and he looks down into the underworld and he picks the runes from this mysterious place of knowledge. And runes in Norse mythology, so rune, the word rune just means secret, and it seems like, or this suggests that they had some kind of magical, mysterious, supernatural power. It's not really clear from the surviving evidence what kind of power that might have been. Runes are really just a writing system. And the other thing, this other kind of wisdom that it's sort of linked with, is this idea of the drink of the precious mead poured from Odin. And Odin means something like stirrer of inspiration, or stirrer of fury, or frenzy, or something like that. And it's linked to both the word I mentioned this morning, which is linked to Edda, so the word Other, meaning poetry, and it's also linked to Odin's own name. Odin is associated with madness, or a kind of frenzy of inspiration, like a divine fury kind of thing. So all of those things go together, really, poetry and divine frenzy and Odin's own name here, as if those are all ways of accessing wisdom, and they're all ways of, I guess, kind of being taken out of yourself. Another story explains how Odin stole the mead of poetry from the giants, and therefore was able to give it to human beings and give them the ability to access poetic inspiration. So Odin is the god of poets. And the mead of poetry was brewed by the dwarves, or given to the giants, and then stolen by Odin, who then possesses it. So it's kind of, that too has passed through a number of the different realms, or the different worlds, the dwarves and the giants, and then the gods, and then Odin gives it to mankind. So again, there's this sense of wisdom having come from a mysterious external place. And this is just one of a number of stories where Odin is thought to have sacrificed something in order to access wisdom. So, as I said, he's always shown as one-eyed because he gave one of his eyes to a dwarf called Mimir, who guarded a well of wisdom under the roots of Yggdrasil, one of the roots of Yggdrasil. And in exchange for a drink from Mimir's well, Odin gave up his eye. So there are sort of a number of stories in which he gives up a bit of his body in order to gain spiritual insight or wisdom of some kind. So I think it's quite interesting, and it's one of the distinctive features of Odin, I guess, as a character, that he is very much imagined as very wise, as like all wise or the wisest one, but that wisdom is not something innate to himself, it's something he has to obtain, and often at great cost to himself. So he's he's sacrificing, he's giving up something, he's straining, striving, seeking, questing for wisdom. It's not sort of an abiding quality. When we were talking this morning about Yggdrasil and its kind of mixture between great strength and power and vitality, but also vulnerability, I think that's a combination you can see in Odin as well, that he is very much a powerful god, the wisest of the gods, the father of the gods, but also physically impaired, like he's got one eye, and he's kind of physically injured, that idea of a vulnerable body. The sense that you get, particularly from a poem like Völuspá and Vafthrudnismal, is that one reason he's seeking wisdom is not just in order to have power over things like poetry, to have the knowledge of the dead, or to have the power of runes, clearly something sort of giving you some sort of supernatural power, but also because he wants to know what will happen at the end of the world. So he wants to know the future, he wants to know what will happen at Ragnarok. He is kind of anxiously searching for information about what will happen to the gods ultimately. And again, that's kind of interesting, because perhaps you would expect that a god who is presented as so very wise would have knowledge of the future without having to go in quest of it, wouldn't you? I mean, it is a sort of a surprising thing. Poetry did hold a very special place in Norse culture. To be a poet was to have a certain knowledge and wisdom of history, of things that are important, and of knowledge about the gods. And that's why, with the kennings we were looking at, why they allude to the gods so often. It's because those poets are sort of advertising that they know a lot about the gods, they know all the right stories. So it kind of goes along with not just the skill to write poetry, but a kind of bank of knowledge that you're drawing on. Odin is also importantly the god associated with the dead. So when we looked at that verse from Völuspá this morning, he's called the father of the slain. That's a name often used for him. And he's the god of the battlefield, who determines who will be successful in battle, who plucks from the battlefield his preferred warriors and takes them off to Valhalla, where they will feast until Ragnarok, where they will take part in the final battle at the end of the world. So Odin is kind of going around cherry-picking warriors from Earth and kind of taking them off to feast with him. And because he is associated with poets and with warriors, that means there are a lot more references to him, there are a lot more stories about him than there are about some of the other gods, because of course it's the poets who wrote the stories, and they were interested in Odin. And most Old Norse literature is about either poets or warriors, as you all know if you've read very much of it. They feature very heavily in the sagas. And so for that reason, we do know more about Odin than we do about most of the gods. So he turns up, he plays an important role in something like, for instance, the story of Sigurd the Volsung, the other story in the Poetic Edda. He turns up at kind of crucial moments in the young hero's life. In the form of an old man, he will meet a young warrior who's in difficulties and will mysteriously, secretly kind of give him a gift that turns out to have magical powers, or help him in a way, in a kind of mysterious way, without ever announcing himself and saying, "I'm Odin, I'm here to help you." He'll just kind of like point to him, give him advice, help him out, but always in disguise, always dressed as the wanderer there. And usually you only know it's Odin because he's hooded to conceal the fact that he's one-eyed. So he always goes around in disguise. Disadvantage of Odin's favour is that it kind of goes both ways. So because he will sometimes help people, but he will also decide that it's their time to die, and so he wants to take them off to Valhalla for his own purposes. So he very much helps warriors, not because they've asked him to, or not because they're particularly virtuous, but because he wants them to be his favoured warriors. At the moment of his choosing, he will, for instance, cause their sword to break in the middle of a battle, and therefore they'll be killed, and then he'll carry them off to Valhalla. So he's supremely wise, but he's also very capricious, very difficult to understand or interpret, and his judgments often in the sagas will often come across as random, like it's the moment, okay, the moment's come, Odin decided to kill this particular person, why now? We don't know, it's just, that's his choice. He's very, very powerful, and he can help those he wants to help, but he's not sort of benevolent, I suppose, in the way that gods might be thought to be. He's not. He's only benevolent if it serves his own purpose.